Hello, my name is Charles Edel. I'm the Australia Chair here at CSIS, and today we're going to discuss our recent white paper, Shifting Tides, the National Security Implications of the United States Pacific Drawdown. Now, in the recent paper that our team has produced, we highlight the cumulative effect of recent U.S. policy actions, including foreign aid pauses and tariffs on the Pacific Island region. What we're going to do today is take a forensic look at those policy moves by diving into the statistics and going through some of the key graphs and figures, and conclude with a discussion of policy recommendations that flows from this analysis. Joining me today is my colleague, Kathryn Paik.
Thanks, Charlie. So multiple administrations have stressed the importance of the Pacific Islands region, but when I look at this map, I see a huge expanse of blue water speckled by a little over a dozen island countries and territories. Could you walk us through a little bit the strategic importance of this region?
Absolutely. Now, look, Kathryn, the United States has long engaged in this region, in fact, over all of American history, but we're not here to talk about history today. In fact, it was really World War II that underscored the critical strategic nature of this geography. Why this region is important now is the reason that it was important then. That having a potentially hostile power grab strategic purchase, strategic foothold in one or multiple of these island nations would allow it to cut the United States off from its allies and would present a whole host of problems on everything from commerce flowing into the region to the security of telecommunications. So while this is clearly strategically significant for America and its allies, over the past multiple decades, since the end of World War II, U.S. engagement has been episodic in how intensely it's engaged with this region and how much it's focused its resource and attention on it.
And that's absolutely right, Charlie. However, over the past decade or so, as China has looked more to this region and increased its influence and activity there, the U.S. has really taken notice. Starting with the first Trump administration and then accelerating through the Biden administration, there was a lot more engagement in this region and also a lot more programming and resources headed to the Pacific Islands.
So, Kathryn, I'm hoping you might be able to begin walking us through the report, really the forensics of it. So recently, one of the policy actions we've seen is drawdowns to America's development assistance to the region. Can you walk us through some of the numbers and what they actually say about the implications for those island nations?
Yeah, these USAID cuts have had a pretty devastating effect across the Pacific Islands region. Overall, the U.S. is only fifth in fifth donor country to the region, and that's behind Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and China. However, what U.S. programming there is a really critical piece of the overall architecture of aid programming to this very economically challenged region. But as you can see from this slide, for several countries, 100% of U.S. aid programming has been cut recently, and that amounts to millions of dollars of lost programming on the ground. And while millions of dollars may be small in the budget for the U.S., these are really big numbers for these countries that are facing significant challenges across the board. And while the administration is still in the process of reviewing the entirety of foreign assistance, it has announced that about 90% of U.S. aid programming will be eliminated overall. And the logic behind these cuts has been to better align foreign assistance with U.S. national security priorities. Right. And of course, that in and of itself is not a flawed premise at all. However, the drastic nature of these cuts and the sudden about-face has really had the opposite effect, and it's reinforced that narrative that China has, that it is China, not the U.S., that is the responsible and reliable partner in the Pacific.
Yeah, I find this chart really interesting, right? It's not all the Pacific Islands, but Papua New Guinea, for instance, the most populated by far of all of them. Some of these other areas like the Solomon Islands that people have read about in the news that clearly have kind of brought to the fore. But I think one of the things that the report brings out is cuts to development aid is only part of what has occurred over the last couple of months. Another big area is Liberation Day, right? The imposition of tariffs not only on the Pacific Island region, but also on the Pacific Island region. Can you walk us through not only the tariffs, but maybe so that people can understand what's the size of U.S. trade with these, frankly, pretty small and oftentimes vulnerable economies?
Yeah, so backing up, the announcement of tariffs was really met with quite a bit of shock and confusion in the region. And for exactly the reason you say, if we want to step back and just look at the total trade numbers here. So overall, two-way trade between the U.S. and all of the Pacific Island countries put together amounts to $1 billion. And that's in comparison to $7 trillion that the U.S. has in global two-way trade. Additionally, the reasons given for these tariffs, principally that they were either to level the playing field or to provide the U.S. with bargaining power, neither of those really holds logic with the Pacific Islands region. So first, let's look at leveling the playing field. All but two of the Pacific Island countries have a trade deficit with the U.S. already. The two that have trade surpluses are Fiji and Tuvalu. And Tuvalu has a trade trade surplus of $168,000 only. And I'll note that Tuvalu has a total population of 11,000 people. So there's no leveling the playing field between the U.S. and Tuvalu. Secondly, to provide bargaining power also was met with a little bit of confusion in this region that doesn't have that much to bargain with to begin with. So most of these leaders, frankly, are pragmatically looking at other options. And I'll read a quote from Prime Minister Marape of Papua New Guinea, who, after the tariff announcement, simply said, "We will continue to strengthen our trade relations in Asia and the Pacific where our produce is welcome. If the U.S. market becomes more difficult due to this tariff, we will simply direct our goods and markets to where there is mutual respect and no artificial barriers."
Yeah, I mean, I think from this chart, what you've really underscored is when we're talking trade, there is enormous amounts of trade, obviously, between the EU, clearly bilaterally between the United States and Australia. But across the region, $1 billion, and then individually by country, the scale of the trade is extraordinarily small, and there's no leverage for these countries to figure out how they break down access to trade barriers.
Exactly.
So, okay, let's step back now, and we've talked about the cuts to development assistance. We've talked about the imposition of tariffs and how difficult it will be for these countries to even engage in a negotiation because there's not much to negotiate with. What are the impacts? So you read that Marape quote, but what are the impacts? What do you see as some of the implications that flow from this to the United States?
So even in just the last few months, we've seen China swiftly move into the space that the U.S. is creating. And that's not just in gaps in resources or programming. This is really about that messaging that I was talking about, reinforcing the narrative of China as the strategic partner for these Pacific Island countries, vice the U.S. or other allies and partners. For example, China's ambassador to Fiji recently announced that there would now be direct flights between Nadi, Fiji, and Shanghai. And in doing so, he noted that given the global disruptions to trade that the U.S. was causing, this was a prime time for Fiji to be looking at establishing closer economic relations with China. China also just hosted the foreign ministers from across the Pacific Islands for the first time in China. And during that meeting, China announced more than 100 programs related to climate change for the region. And these were this was a very welcome measure for the region, given that climate change is the top national security threat for the Pacific Islands. And then, of course, this was in contrast to the U.S., which is not just cutting back on climate programming, but just recently withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement.
So really underscoring and emphasizing the contrast between how both nations are responding to the interests of those nations.
Exactly.
You know, look, you just mentioned Prime Minister Marape's comments from Papua New Guinea, but these are sentiments that seem to be being expressed more frequently across the Pacific. Prime Minister Rabuka of Fiji himself said, look, the world's bigger than the United States. We don't have anything to counter with, so we'll have to weather the storm and we'll have to roll with the punches. So I want to look at how the United States engages. These are new policy initiatives, but if the United States is going to correct course to make sure that it has as much influence and impact as it possibly can in the region, in the report that we've just written, what are some of the recommendations that we roll out?
So we mentioned several recommendations in our report, but I'd like to highlight two here. First and foremost is the U.S. needs to follow through on existing commitments. And top among those is our compacts of free association agreements that we have with Palau, FSM, and RMI, Republic of Marshall Islands and Federated States of Micronesia. So these agreements not only give the U.S. unilateral defense access across the North Pacific, all the way from the Philippines across to Hawaii, but these agreements are also considered baseline for U.S. commitment to the entire region. So the second proposal, or the second policy recommendations that we had to do with trade. So tariffs are likely to remain a favorite tool of this administration, but outside of tariffs, there are other ways to meaningfully and pragmatically engage the Pacific region on trade. For example, we could support a Pacific trade representative in Washington, D.C. to engage with the business community and raise awareness among U.S. business community and business circles of opportunities that exist in the Pacific Islands region.
Thanks, Kathryn. I really appreciate that you highlighted those recommendations. I know there are a lot more than just 2 recommendations in there because this is meant to be not only analysis but also real meaty policy recommendations. So for those of you who would like to make sure that you understand the full suite of what we have laid out in this report, please make sure that you look at the report, Shifting Tides, the National Security Implications of the United States Pacific Drawdown, which you can find on csis.org. Thanks very much for tuning in and watching.